Welcome to the latest PRovoke Media Podcast. I am here with the two co-founders and partners of ROKK Solutions, a public affairs firm that operates at the intersection of politics and communication. And joining me are Rodell Mollineau and Bonjean. And delighted to have you here, guys. We are going to be talking about the current political situation in the United States and, of course, its implications for business and specifically its implications for public relations and corporate communications people. I'm going to start with, we're recording this the day after Sarah Palin lost the special election in Alaska in what I think it's fair to characterize as an upset. It is the latest in, I think it's fair to call it a series now, of results that have gone slightly better than anticipated for Democrats, who were widely expected to lose the House and were struggling to cling on to the Senate in the midterm elections. So I guess my first question has to be, have predictions for the outcome of these upcoming elections shifted any, and have they shifted enough that Democrats should be more optimistic about the House than they were a little while ago? Rodell, what's your take on that?
Sure. I actually think, and Ron and I talk about this a lot. This is, I think, an opportunity for me to say that I have been right, but I'm joking. I actually think that the dynamics haven't changed all that much. If we would have had this conversation 3 or 4 months ago, I would have said that due to pure demography, geographics, that the Republicans are going to win the House, and I believe that is still going to happen. I believed that the Democrats had a good chance of keeping the Senate due to the strength of their candidates, especially their incumbents, the fact that we were going to have an opportunity to pick up a seat in Pennsylvania. So that hasn't changed. Now, I think we have a little bit more breathing room than we had, say, 3 or 4 months ago. And then the third piece of this for me was that Democrats had a good opportunity to keep some of the gubernatorial, some of the governor seats, especially Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which will be important for us in 2024. And that looks as though that is still on track as well. What's happening in the House, once again, I do believe that Republicans still have the advantage there, but to my point, I think this is just degrees of variation, how many seats that they win. It certainly does not look like it'll be a blowout or a landslide, but I would be shocked if Republicans did not control the House the day after the election in November.
Okay, I should say that ROKK Solutions is a pretty bipartisan outfit, I think it's fair to say. And Ron, do you have a different perspective on how this is going to play out?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. It's great to be here, Paul. I would have to say the Republicans are likely going to take the House. The trends are favoring them in that direction. There's just so many races that are leaning GOP in the House. There's no doubt that it's going to happen. I think that how many seats they win is still up in the air. And I think this is going to switch week by week because things in the American news cycle have a tendency to be absorbed rather quickly with another news event that then overtakes it. So where we are now is is the conventional wisdom is that Republicans may not win as many seats, but that could absolutely change the closer we could get, or it could be extremely narrow. So we're in this tumultural period where we could have a few more surprises.
It's interesting. Rodell, you said, you didn't think that the big picture had changed very much over the last 2 or 3 months. Does that mean that that we all overestimate the impact of, well, first of all, the overturning of Roe versus Wade was supposed to energize a wave of Democratic voters, and we have seen registrations of Democratic voters running ahead of Republicans, new registrations since then. And then, of course, the quote unquote raid on Mar-a-Lago was supposed to energize Trump supporters who were outraged that he might actually be answerable to the rule of law. And that was supposed to swing things back in the other direction. Do we overestimate the importance of those events because people are so entrenched, or do you just think that there are so many pushes and pulls on each side that we've sort of ended up back where we were?
I agree with Ron on the premise that the news media has a way of shifting and changing and sharpening the narratives as it pertains to these races. Last year we were in the midst of a supply chain crisis. If you remember, around Christmas time last year, there were going to be no Christmas presents because we couldn't get anything off of the shipping containers. That didn't happen. We've gone through this period of rising prices, especially on gas prices. Now those prices are coming down. They're certainly not where they were a year and a half ago, but they have come down from some of the prices. I think the biggest thing that has changed over the last few months is that the 2022 election is now more of a choice and less of a referendum. 3 or 4 months ago, if we would have had this conversation, this was all about President Biden and the fact that Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, and things weren't looking great. And to the extent that we, being Democrats, control the White House, the House, and the Senate, when things aren't going well, you look at the people in charge, and those are Democrats. I think that Roe v. Wade has shifted that a little bit and has reminded voters that there are two parties with two completely different philosophies. And I think that has given some voters, especially independent voters, pause. So this is no longer just about inflation and crime, where I think that Republicans would love for this election to be about. It's still about inflation and it's still about crime, but it's also about reproductive rights. I think it's about the rule of law. I think that there are just other issues that will be on voters' minds as they go to the ballot box in November.
We could have a whole conversation about how the issue of crime and the issue of rule of law seem to be two entirely separate issues, depending on which side of the political aisle you're on. But I don't think we have time. I don't think we have time for that in this particular format. Let's accept for a moment the premise that both of you agree with, which is that the House is likely to flip, and we're going to see a Republican House, that Democrats have a decent chance of holding on to the Senate, and that obviously Joe Biden will still be president when all this is done. So what we're looking at is divided government for the first time in a little while. And I guess my questions around that are, from a business point of view, will the fact of a divided government be materially different from what we've seen over the last couple of years, given that, even though it's a sort of 50-50 Senate and the vice president obviously has the deciding vote there, you've had a couple of Democrats who have, on a lot of big issues, functioned as sort of adjuncts to the Republican Party. So we haven't necessarily had the activist government that people on the Democratic side would have liked to have seen. Will an actual divided government be dramatically different from what we've seen in a couple of years? And how does business behave differently when faced with a divided government, Ron?
Yeah, no, great question. I think that Democrats were able to get several significant pieces of legislation done over this summer because they finally came together with the reality that the election was upon them, and there was enough pressure for them to act rather fast. That's going to stop next year. If Republicans take over the Senate with divided government, you're going to have a stalemate where Republicans will be focused on their issues in the House, passing pieces of legislation that will land over in the Senate and likely not receive the attention that Republicans would like to have. But they will be the Republicans will be using the House as a messaging vehicle for 2024, really, as their foundation. President Biden will be forced to basically use his executive powers, issuing executive orders, because nothing's really going to get through. Besides maybe funding the government with their, early next year with threats of a government shutdown. But even then, it could be very difficult and could stretch out. So I don't see a lot happening there. However, I will say this, that and I'm sure we're going to talk about this in a little bit. For businesses, they still need to be actively engaged in the public policy arena, because while there are big pieces of legislation that may not move, there will be 1, 2, or 3 vehicles that will move eventually that have to do with functioning of the government. And those will get loaded up. B, there are lots of other issues that don't get attention in the news, that get attention in Congress, that businesses really need to stay on top of.
I mean, we should get to that in a second. I mean, I'm interested just because, it's very easy listening to Republican candidates to get the impression that, day one in the House is basically just impeach everybody in sight, right? So impeach Fauci, impeach Garland, impeach Biden. Let's just go crazy. Getting revenge for the sort of last couple of years of the Trump government. Is there actually any kind of activist agenda underneath that business should be focused on, or is it in fact, as you say, Ron, the sort of day-to-day business of budgets and reconciliation bills, and that we deal with on an ongoing basis anyway?
I think looking at it, there will be definitely a high level of oversight over the Biden administration, as you had alluded to. But they're also going to start pushing their agenda items, such as cutting taxes, spending, regulations. They're going to go after the IRS funding 80,000 new IRS employees. That's going to be a ripe issue. They're going to go after big tech regarding the censorship issue, and probably working on stripping them of Section 230 in the House. Border security, of course, they're going to want to start building the wall again, and repealing Biden's immigration moves. And another significant issue here is they're going to go after, and a lot of Republicans have been campaigning about this, they're going to go after wokeism, quote unquote. So those are some of the things that are going to be focused on.
I definitely want to come back to that issue of sort of wokeism. I think we called it good manners when I was growing up, but anyway, I think we'll come back to that issue of wokeism later, but particularly since a lot of that activity is going to happen at the state level, I think, regardless of whether Republicans can do anything within the federal government. But I am interested, you mentioned the tech issue, for example, and that's an issue that sort of points to me, and maybe I'm behind the curve on this. Maybe this has already happened and it's old news to people like you who are down there in the nitty-gritty of it on a day-to-day basis. But I came up in the US in an environment where it was widely assumed that Republicans were the party of big business. Republicans were corporate friendly. Republicans were, anti-regulation and pro-tax cuts for corporations and everything basically that CEOs and shareholders wanted. But when you look at the technology companies, as you mentioned, Ron, when you look at some of, and I guess we'll drift inevitably into wokeism, because when you look at Republicans trying to find sort of countermeasures for ESG initiatives and a sort of conscious capitalism. It's clearly no longer as black and white as it once was. That Republicans and corporate leaders are not nearly as closely aligned as they once were. Is that something new? Is it something that most corporate public affairs people and trade associations have already built into their thinking, or is it something that they're going to have to come to terms with, a few months from now?
I think. Oh, please. Go ahead, Rodell. Did you want to say something?
Sure. I would say that some companies are a little bit ahead of the curve, and there are other companies that need to do some work on this. And I think that this has been a slow boiling pot. I'd probably say starting in about 2018 or so, and has just gotten increasingly hotter for these companies. And let's separate them. The tech piece of this is interesting, because the irony is that if Democrats and Republicans could put aside their partisan differences, they actually could come up with legislation to rein in, and I say that quote unquote, tech companies. It's just that they have two very different reasons for wanting to do it. Democrats believe that some of these, especially the social media companies, are letting too much disinformation online, and to Ron's point before, Republicans think that there is too much censorship, especially of conservative ideas and conservative voices. But there's some overlap as far as agreement on some of the competitiveness and antitrust nature of tech companies that Democrats and Republicans could likely get together on. But I'm not sure that they can put aside their partisan differences to come up with a bill that would actually pass. I mean, right now we're looking at a piece of legislation in the Senate. It is a legislation that is sponsored by Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican from Iowa, and Senator Amy Klobuchar, Democrat from Minnesota. It's the closest that there's a companion bill over on the House side with David Cicilline, Democrat from Rhode Island, and Ken Buck, Republican from Colorado. That this is the closest that Democrats and Republicans have ever gotten to crafting a piece of legislation that would hold big tech accountable. And I'm not sure that it gets done this year, and this would be the year to do it. And I think that it gets harder and harder the closer that we get to an election. Doesn't mean that there will not be a lot of saber rattling. Doesn't mean that there won't be hearings and that the Republicans won't call these tech companies up for hearings. It does mean, however, that as far as legislatively, big tech might escape any policy changes over the next couple of years.
Are there any other sectors beyond technology that should be concerned about bipartisan agreement on issues that affect those industries? Typically, obviously, the sort of hyper-regulated industries, financial services and energy and the like, healthcare, are the most visible in Washington. Is there anything coming down the pipe that impacts those sectors or impacts another sector that should be concerned right now?
I think, getting into the wokeism issue, if we could talk about that for just a second, because I think it's really important. I think that, companies that have been expressing themselves that, on these issues, Republicans are going to be looking at academia, media, technology, ESG, and because they control the House of Representatives, they're going to control the committees that make policy, from finance, energy, labor, healthcare, you name it. So, and they have subpoena power to compel those CEOs and organizational leaders to testify before hearings that can be televised live. So, if I were a public relations consultant, or, an agency working for companies in those sectors, I will be preparing those clients for an aggressive approach from Republicans and how best to respond through crisis mitigation planning, social media listening, media training. All those kind of things need to be employed here, because while Republicans will be looking backwards at some of the issues like, on education, like critical race theory, or talking about, investigating companies that prioritize ESG issues when investing in pensions, those kind of things. There are going to be issues that are going to pop up in the news cycle where Republicans will now have the power to make it more newsworthy than ever. So I think that's the one thing that if I were to encourage people who are listening to this is really get ready for that, because there are a lot of public relation firms that don't have public affairs components here, in Washington. And obviously we're here to help.
Hey, look, I think a lot of this can be traced back to the events at the very start of the year in Florida, right? Where you had this sort of new legislation, the quote unquote "Don't Say Gay" bill that came down that radically transformed what was being taught in Florida schools, and seemed to be an assault on LGBTQ kids. You had Disney sitting on the sidelines, sort of resolutely, at least at first, refusing to get involved, and apparently unconcerned about its values and the way in which they might clash with what was going on in Florida. And then you saw this sort of complete 180 from Disney, where they turned around and became the leading voice speaking out on behalf of the kids on the receiving end of what DeSantis was doing in Florida. And I think all of that seemed pretty normal to me. I mean, I've been doing this long enough to have seen this around 100 different issues over the years, where corporations decided that their values were important to them and wanted to get involved in issues ranging from abortion to immigration. And then you saw very targeted, very specific attempts by the governor of Florida to retaliate against Disney. And I'm not sure that I'd ever seen anything quite like that before. That sort of very specific targeting of a company because it exercised its free speech and used its marketing and communications expertise to advocate for a cause. And I'm not sure I've ever seen the machinery of government employed in that way. Is that something dramatically different? And is that a genie that's out of the bottle now? Is that going to be the new normal for companies? Rodell.
I think that it is, and Paul, I would say that this goes back even 1 year before this, and I think where the seeds of this were truly planted was January 6th and beyond, where you had companies speaking out about January 6th, weighing in on President Biden being the duly elected president. Then there was this time of companies deciding whether or not that they were publicly deciding that they were not going to give money in forms of contribution to elected officials who did not certify the election. Then right after that, there was the voting rights debate in Georgia and a couple of other states, where companies started speaking out against what they viewed as voting rights legislation that would disenfranchise, especially people of color. And all of those things together led us to what happened with Disney. So I think that there was already a rift starting between some of these companies who were speaking out, whether they were speaking out because of their values or because of their employees or because of their customer base, and these governors and these state legislatures and these federal legislatures that were like, what's happening here? We used to kind of be lockstep. You did business. We took care of policy. We took care of you on the tax side. You shut your mouth and you reap the rewards and let us go about it. And now you're challenging us at every turn. And that led us to what happened with Disney. And listen, Governor DeSantis, I think, was the first person to say, wait a minute, we might not be a multi-billion-dollar company like Disney, but we're the state of Florida, and Republicans control the reins of power there, and we're going to push back. And I think that's exactly what happened. And if you're a company, I think that you need to really take a look at that, because I think that there are going to be many imitations of that moving forward if a company decides that they are going to speak out on a political issue. And I think it's one of the reasons why over the last several years, Ron and I, working with our strategic partner, Steve Rockland at Impact ROI, have been counseling Fortune 100s on how to respond to these social issues, and how to really take stock of social risk within their company.
Okay. Ron, is this business taking an unprecedented interest in issues that are outside of its traditional sphere of influence, or is this government exercising an unprecedented, or attempting to exercise an unprecedented degree of control over how CEOs and boards of directors run their companies?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would say that in terms of businesses, there's more of an expectation by the constituencies of a corporation, whether it's the employees, their suppliers, customers, that they play more of an active role in what's going on with society. There seems to be more pressures there for them to handle and for them to address. And frankly, according to various polls, people's employers are now the place where people trust the most. Like, institutions have degraded so much over the course of these years that a person's place of employment now is the most trustworthy. So there's that. And then in terms of government involvement, we're seeing much more of a populist tendency. This is not these aren't conservative moves. This is a populist tendency for elected officials to jump in and say, hold on, what's going on here? So you have two confluence of things happening and meeting at the same time. It's sort of like the force versus the movable object. When you have Disney saying, this is how we feel, and this is the way we think we should do things, DeSantis says, well, no one's going to tell us what to do, so I'm going to tell you what to do, so to speak. So you have this sort of back and forth, if you will. We're going to see a lot more in that. That's why we invented a thing called STAR, the Social Threat Assessment and Response service here at ROKK Solutions, so that we can help companies really assess these threats, these social risks, before they happen. Actually scenario planning and figuring out, if something is to come on the radar screen, should they actually respond to it? Do they put out a statement internally or externally? How best do they navigate those waters? And we've gotten in front of this well before this took off. And this part of our business is going quite well. And we actually think there's going to be a lot of more of it come on next year.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me, because as I watched the Disney thing and the initial prevarication on Disney's part, it reminded me of a thing that happened 30 years ago with Dayton Hudson and Planned Parenthood, and that sort of inability to decide, should we be funding Planned Parenthood? Should we withdraw our funding? Do we want to piss off the religious right, or do we want to, piss off, women's health advocates? And how do we make that decision? And it just seemed to me that in 30 years, we hadn't figured out, and I'm using a very collective we that obviously doesn't include you guys, but that business had not figured out how to put together a process and a framework for making those decisions. As you say, is this an issue in which we or our stakeholders have a valid interest? If it is, do we want to actively or in some sort of passive way, support or get engaged with one side? Do we speak out on it, or do we stay quiet? Do we take our own actions, or do we just voice our support? And all of those things, Disney seemed to be improvising and not very well.
Right.
I'm intrigued by the fact that you've created a product to take people through that process. I mean, I know others have tried to do something similar as well. Do you find that companies have more of a process than they did, or are they still coming to you with a create a framework for us, essentially?
I think that companies have the tools. It's just a matter of organizing them in the right way, and that's why they needed a process and a framework. Quite frankly, these decisions can't just be made at the C-suite level, which is oftentimes where they are made. I think that there needs to be a discussion about how these, whatever decision it is, how it affects the different business lines, how it affects internal and external stakeholders, how it affects your government affairs function. If you have your C-suite saying, we believe in this, and then the next day you have your government affairs folks going into a legislator's office, and then they have to defend that issue, and then they haven't truly been read into why this decision has been made, it makes it harder for them as well. So what we've been able to do is sit down. It's a very thorough months-long process of getting the right folks within a company together from the different business lines, different parts of the companies, getting them out of their silos to make these decisions together and to buy into these decisions together. So whatever the decision is, and we do not make recommendations as to whether or not you should weigh in on this and weigh in on that. For us, it's about the process and about going through it, making sure all of the right people have been bought in to that process. And then when that decision is made, making sure that everyone's rowing in the same direction. Everybody is on this has the same talking points and has explained to the employees, the suppliers, the other stakeholders that this is why we have made this decision. This is why we're speaking out.
I'm really interested in, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly, also that businesses that really manage social risks well have seen increases in their financial performance, from increases in their share price and productivity to reductions in turnover. I mean, this isn't just navigating government, government oversight. This can be really helpful to them overall. And so, we're at a real transformative moment in businesses. And I think our service provides their senior leadership, the decisive counsel it needs to act in that kind of financial forward way too.
Right. I mean, it's really interesting to me that we are entering a realm, it seems, in which companies are going to have to choose between whether they're going to have to choose when they listen to their stakeholders, employees and consumers in particular, but also, lots of people now within the financial community are advocating for greater environmental sustainability, social and governance awareness, or whether they want to listen to a very powerful stakeholder group in Washington and in the state capitals that maybe is pushing them heavily, depending on the state, in the other direction. And I wonder where all of this is going. Are we going to get to a point in a few years where companies essentially have to declare that they're either blue or red, that they are, Democratic companies or Republican companies, that they are stakeholder companies, or they are adjuncts of the Republican Party? That last one is probably a little unfair, but a company's going to have to pick a side.
Listen, I think that for some companies there is a have your cake and eat it too. They certainly want to attract customers, and if speaking out on their values helps to attract those customers, then that's fine. But at the end of the day, these companies, and I think this is something that they should always go back to, whatever it is that they are doing, there needs to be a business reason for this. And I think that this is going to be extremely important for companies, especially over the next 2 years as they navigate a Republican House and more and increasing pressure from Republicans, especially on the ESG piece of it. There is this notion that, and this gets to the whole wokeism, and I hate that word, but there is this notion that these companies, especially these financial institutions, BlackRock, Goldman, JP Morgan, are considering ESG analysis in their investments because they have somehow gone over to the left side. They're all completely blue. And that's just not the case. They're making it because they think that long term that they will make more money for themselves and their shareholders should they take these considerations into account. The problem is that the considerations that they're taking into account tend to minimize other constituencies on the Republican side, including fossil fuels, sometimes gun manufacturers. And I think that's the situation that some of these companies are in. They're trying to make these long-term investments. And I think on the other side, you have Republicans saying, yeah, you're making these long-term investments, one, at the expense of other constituencies, and two, at the short-term expense of shareholders. So I think it's going to be extremely important for companies to, especially financial institutions, to have a clear plan on how they're going to communicate that their investment strategy is part of their overall business strategy and will actually lead to better outcomes for their shareholders long term.
Okay. I think we're probably coming to the end of our allotted time. It's been such a fun conversation. I feel like we didn't even talk about Black Lives Matter. We didn't even talk about Ukraine. We didn't even talk about sort of half a dozen other things that companies have been wrestling with over the last couple of years that have sort of brought us to this place. Maybe we can come back and do that at a separate time. But bringing the focus back to sort of what's going to happen in the midterm elections and what happens immediately after that. Starting with you, Ron, I'll let you weigh in a second, Rodell. But starting with you, what's the sort of big advice that you're giving to corporate communications and public affairs people right now in terms of what they need to be sort of girding their loins for in 3 or 4 months' time?
Yeah, I think that public relations agencies, they should be preparing their clients for a change in leadership on the House. It's going to be a very different Washington, and really starting to figure out the crisis mitigation, where their vulnerabilities are, but also, frankly, how do they talk to new elected officials? How do they talk to a new majority? That's going to be super important. They've been used to communicating one way to Democrats who have been running the town. Well, now Republicans will be running part of the town. So figuring out how to navigate those waters, what they're most receptive to in terms of, how you tell your company's story or your client's story, it's going to be really important.
I think this is one of the reasons why Ron and I have worked so well and been able to build ROKK over the last 7 years, is that we agree much more than we disagree, regardless of our political affiliation. I completely agree with what Ron said, especially this last part. Is in 2018, when we started our social impact practice, it was built on the premise that you had a new Congress coming in, many of whom thought for one reason or other, and it wasn't just you saw this in their campaigns, and they came in with this mindset that corporations were evil. I think corporations have spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C. over the last few years talking about their CSR and their ESG initiatives and trying to make inroads with the Democratic Congress. I think that they're going to have to do the same thing as new folks come in, and there'll be more Republicans that come in than Democrats. I think they're going to have to do the inverse, having conversations with a new Republican majority about their business model, why their business model is good for America, for the specific districts that these Republicans represent. And then the last thing that I'd say is that I think the next 2 years will be contentious. They just will. The media loves conflict. When you have it, there might not be a lot that gets done, but it'll certainly be interesting. And so if you're a business that is doing work in Washington, D.C., How do you navigate that? How do you stay on the sidelines in a way that you don't become part of the food fight going back and forth between Democrats and Republicans? And that's what we're counseling our clients on right now, is how do you stay out of the fray and continue to diligently communicate to Congress your business needs without getting into the political and the partisan back and forth.
I always like to say it's like, you want to have a productive conversation behind closed doors instead of under the hot lights during an oversight committee hearing.
Yes, that's great. Thanks, guys.